I like to say we design buildings that stand out by fitting in.
This episode of Coffee Talks is brought to you by Markham LLP Accountants and Advisors.
Hello, folks, and welcome to another edition of Coffee Talk. Today we have renowned architect Morris Adjmi, who's designed over 27 million square feet of built space and was recently awarded the prestigious ICFF Designer of the Year Award for 2023. Morris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Amir. Happy to be here.
So you are a New Orleans guy. You grew up in New Orleans, and then you came to New York. And I see your buildings everywhere. And it's funny because your last name also happens to be the last name of a family that's a major landlord here in New York City. Did that help you get business in New York?
Not really.
No. But you worked for the Pritzker Prize architect Aldo Rossi. That's where you started your career.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where I started. I grew up in New Orleans. I think that's really why I became interested in architecture. That led me to work with Aldo Rossi. I studied with him at the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies here in New York.
Yeah.
And I'd say that the first project that we did together here in New York, the Scholastic Building, is what really sort of launched my career here.
He was a mentor to you initially.
Yeah.
And then you guys became collaborators.
Well, I studied with him for a year. Then I ended up working in the office in Milan for 3 years. Mm-hmm. And then he called me when he wanted to open an office here in New York. And I headed up that office for 10 years. He knew about my growing up in New Orleans, and he really liked the city.
How many buildings have you done in New York City?
Oh, dozens.
Dozens,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think that...
Aldo died prematurely in a car accident in 1997, and I think his career had just been, taking off.
Yeah.
He had won a number of awards, but a number of important projects. The German History Museum was another one that he had won, and we had done together 12 projects in Japan. So he was doing a lot of work around the world.
Yeah.
And it was just starting to happen here in the United States.
And then it just sort of took off.
Yeah.
You talk about contextual design.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I like to say we design buildings that stand out by fitting in. Mm-hmm. They really work and play nicely together with the surroundings. So we're not trying to make a building that says, hey, look at me. We're trying to make a building that works really well in the context of the city. Mm-hmm. And New York really is a city that is a big grid. So everything really wants to be part of that grid. And I think the way that you weave the building into it is what we do really well, and I think really important.
520 West 20th, I love that building.
Thank you.
And it's like this old warehouse building that looks like an alien ship has landed on top of it. But that doesn't necessarily fit into the scope of the street.
I mean, I think that there are different ways to relate to context, right? And I think you picked two buildings that were adaptive reuse, which I think is also important, from a sustainability point of view, but also from a historic and a contextual point of view. At 520, we used a very crisp, almost bridge-like structure that sits on top of the building. We put two new cores in the building, and that structure actually bridges between those two cores. And the references to the building, you have a very strong masonry brick building as a base, and then the top really references a more modern Miesian kind of expression. And I think that contrast works really well in the context because you have buildings along the High Line that recall that sort of structure and the strength of that the High Line itself.
Yeah.
And so that kind of was a reference for that building. And then in Samsung, I think was very different. Samsung restored and retained a purpose-built meatpacking building, and then inserted another building that sort of, I like to say, coexists on the site.
Right.
And it really references all of the different grids of the city coming together in those neighborhoods.
Yeah.
That meatpacking, Greenwich Village,
and
Chelsea.
Obviously, that building also did really well for its owner because at one point it was the most expensive commercial office building in the city.
Yeah. I like it all, and I think that I like to work at all different scales as well because I think by working at on different types of projects, the experiences inform the way you work on the other projects. Like what's happening now in residential is strongly influenced by hospitality design, and vice versa. Hospitality design really went through a big change in that people tried to make those spaces more residential. And so I think that it goes back and forth. And I think working at small and big scales also enables us to look at details and get really into the project.
What are some examples of hospitality emulating residential and vice versa?
You know, I think there's a trend to make the experience feel less cookie cutter, feel more personal, and feel less constructed and a little more relaxed.
And you just did work for Related, right? Which is like one of the biggest private developers in the country.
Yeah.
That's a good feeling when you get that call.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had a great relationship with Related. We did 2 buildings with them in DC, and 1 project in Chicago in the West Loop, which is finished. And we're finishing up a tall 46-story tower in the West Loop.
Yeah. In Chicago.
Called The Row, in Chicago.
And how is it working with different kinds of developers? I mean, you've worked with all sorts, but like, working with say a Related versus a local developer, is there a major difference?
The Related team's very experienced, and we worked really closely together from the very beginning on the details of the facade. They had bought into the original design, and they brought somebody in for design assist, and they really worked to make sure that we were able to achieve the vision of what we proposed.
And what's your general attitude about designing office building today? I mean, your approach must have changed since the pandemic.
We've seen certainly less office buildings, but there's been a tremendous amount of activity in lab buildings. And so I think that what we're seeing is when there's an opportunity for an office building, they're baking in, additional floor height, ventilation, loading, all of the things you need for lab buildings, and that's obviously in specialty markets on the West Coast. In the Bay Area, we're doing a very large lab complex, as well as in Boston. But we're seeing also in some other markets interest in lab, like Denver, for example.
And what's going to happen to cities if there's no need or 50% less need for office space?
I think it's going to be replaced by more entertainment and more activities for leisure. I think that we'll still see cities as important and viable. And I get all my energy from being in cities, so I can't imagine not being in cities and not frequenting and living in a city. But it's certainly going to change. I think there are certainly tasks that are probably just as well or better served doing at home, but there's certain things that we do that we can't do at home, and I'm just trying to augment and make the experience in the office that much more valuable. We have tremendous amount of activities that help center people and bring them back.
But now you have, some of these AI tools that are out there. They're incredible in how fast they can create renderings and how fast they can change those renderings. I mean, the fact that you could put dimensions into it and put your lot size into the machine, and it could spit out different kind of designs and renderings, and even change the style of them, like if you want it to be colonial or if you want it to be contemporary. How is that going to impact your business?
I look at it as a tool.
Yeah.
I think that for us to not employ it, AI is a mistake. And I think to run away, or some people said we should freeze AI development for some time. It's never going to happen.
What's the argument? Oh, the full AI development. Right.
We need to embrace it, and we need to stay ahead of it, and we need to use it and see how we can use it best. Architecture didn't change because of the computer. That opened up new ways for us to look at space. It looked at to bend materials, to shape materials, to produce materials. So I think AI is only going to be a tool in our arsenal of. Even now, we can envision space much more accurately than we ever could, and it just helps us make better spaces.
And then in terms of the trends that you're seeing in architecture, what are some of those trends that you're seeing that...
I think the amount of interest in sustainability and carbon neutral design has just is exponentially more relevant. And I think, even we're doing a dorm at Berkeley, and that's, carbon neutral building. And we're seeing that the institutions and the clients are much more focused on it. And I see it continuing to happen. But even I was just recently with a company, Brickworks. We've done a lot of buildings with Glengarry, which is a Brickworks company. It's a big Australian company. And they've reduced their energy usage by some like 48%, in the production of bricks.
Like how do they do that?
Just in the gases they use when they're making the bricks. But I think it translates to everything, like how you form the brick, how heavy the brick is, what kind of materials you use in the brick, how you transport it, what materials and you use to actually fuel the furnaces. So I think all of that is becoming more and more relevant, and it's going to help us achieve greater things.
But you tend to use a good amount of brick in your work. Why do you think that is?
I think glass, for the most part, is a soulless material. And I think we see a lot of glass buildings that have, they look ideal in a rendering, and then you see the real building, and you're like, wait, that's the real building? So I think we need to use other materials to give our projects a spirit, a soul, and humanity. And I think brick is a basic building block, and it gives us a lot of options in terms of color, shape, the history of a brick and the way it was used in different ways, even laid up by different cultures. I think imbues a certain sense for projects.
For new architects who want to come into the field and make a career in architecture, what do you recommend to them now with all of this AI stuff that's happening? How do you suggest for people who are coming out of school right now to create value for themselves as architects?
For me, the most important thing for an architect is to not be an architect. I mean, the most important thing is to get as much experience as you can. I was just down at Tulane, where I went to school, and what I thought was really interesting about their program is that you can combine it with majors in business or in sustainability, sustainable design, and development. And I think that that's what's really going to make architects more successful. Is pairing an ability to create buildings with other skill sets. Because if we're just so focused on architecture, I think we're going to get lost.
What do you mean by other skill sets? What would be a...
I think it's important to understand about development, not just about pure architecture. I mean, we have to be great architects, but also whether it's sustainability or AI or some other aspect that can help to enhance what you do.
Are you working on any office to residential conversions right now?
We are, yes, we are. We're actually working on a couple of office to hospitality conversions. And I've seen those probably more frequently, but I think there's going to be a lot more office to residential.
We always talk about like the people who can figure out how to take the office stock and repurpose it. That's the billion-dollar idea, right?
Absolutely.
If you could become that known architect where you have like so much experience taking offices and converting them to hospitality or residential or whatever else, I think there's tremendous value in that.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a huge potential market right now. The silver lining is that so many buildings that were designed for one purpose work really well for another purpose. I mean, think of museums like Mass MoCA that was, warehouses, or manufacturing that functions as a museum. Or the Wythe Hotel we talked about. That was they made barrels there. Now it's the hipster hotel. So I think there's plenty of opportunities. We're looking at projects in Nashville, which were storage buildings, and looking at some of those being office and some of them being residential.
This used to be a chocolate factory.
Exactly.
Now we produce real estate news. Well, Morris, thank you so much for joining us today. This was great. And thank you guys all for tuning in.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take care.